Masechet Nedarim Daf Ayin Zayin, we begin talking about nullifying vows on Shabbat, and that will lead into a discussion of nullifying vows at night with one person, even if that person is a relative. Okay, these are going to be all very relevant because nowadays, at least our community has a custom to do Hatarat Nedarim at night, usually on Mosei Shabbat, even though generally courts do not meet at night. So is this valid? Also, Kal Nidreh on Yom Kippur is done also at night. All right, so we're going to see all about that. We begin. Tanan Hatam, there's a Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat that says, Mefirin Nedarim b'Shabbat v'nish'alin lindarim shehen l'sorech Shabbat. There's a difference between Hafarat Nedarim and Nish'alin, Hash'alat Nedarim. Mefirin, that refers to a husband annulling. We'll use the word annulling the wife's vows that gets annulled from the beginning. He doesn't want her to ever have had it. Nish'alin means to request. That's talking about anyone who makes a vow. It doesn't have to be on the same day that anyone hears about it. Can come at any point to a sage or to a bet din and request that they dissolve the vow, and they look into it, and so it's not automatic, right? Each one has different criteria that which one can use. One is only by the husband, one's by a chacham or by a bet din, and one can be done only during that day, one can be done anytime. So v'nish'alin, that refers to a sage, and here's another distinction between them, that nedarim a husband can annul them on Shabbat, whereas dissolving vows can only be done on Shabbat if it's related. It's for the purpose of Shabbat. A person makes a vow that they're not going to drink wine, but that is going to take away from their oneg Shabbat, so that would be something that they can dissolve on Shabbat. But if someone takes a vow that they're never going to drive anymore, well, they're not driving on Shabbat anyway. In that case, one could not dissolve that on Shabbat. That's the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat. Question: Ibaya lehu mefirin nedarim b'Shabbat lesorech Shabbat or dilma afilu shelo lesorech? It says, can the husband annul a vow on Shabbat only if it's related to Shabbat, or even if it's not related to Shabbat? In other words, that Mishnah was not clear. It said that you can do hafarat nedarim on Shabbat, a husband can annul, but doesn't say what circumstance. But then for the second clause, it says that a bet din can dissolve a vow only if it's for Sorech Shabbat. This phrase, L'Sorech Shabbat, does that modify only the second clause about Hash'alah, or does it modify also the first clause? And so you can read it all as one, that both the husband can annul and a sage can dissolve a vow on Shabbat only if it's for the purpose of Shabbat. Right, so it's referring to all of them, or maybe it's only referring to the second, but a husband can dissolve his wife's vow even if on Shabbat, even if it's not related to Shabbat. That's the question, and we have an answer. Tashema. Detane Rav Zuti Debe Rav Papi and Mafirin Nedarim Ela Lesorech HaShabbat. Here you see it says that husband only annuls a vow on Shabbat if it's for the purpose of Shabbat. Okay, so we have an answer. Amar Rav Asher, Hada tenan hachi nedara im chashecha mefela ad shelo techshach. But Rav Asher countered this and this baraita and said this baraita does not seem to agree with our Mishnah, the Mishnah that we saw on the daf yesterday, which said that if a wife makes a vow close to nighttime, meaning on Saturday afternoon, a few minutes before before sunset, then the husband can annul the vow as long as it's before nightfall, right? If it's 5 minutes before, he has those 5 minutes. Now, let's analyze. And if you say that a husband can only annul his wife's vows for the purpose of Shabbat, but if it's not for the purpose of Shabbat, then what does this have to do with why specify nightfall? Even if it were any anytime during the day, he would not be able to, because it's not for the purpose of Shabbat. In other words, any vow that she's making a few minutes before Shabbat, surely it has no application for the purpose of Shabbat. Even if she says, I'm not going to have meat anymore. I'm never going to eat meat. Okay, so for 5 minutes on Shabbat, you don't have to have meat those 5 minutes, right? It's nothing that could be that pressing that will be for the purpose of Shabbat to nullify that vow. And therefore, since the Mishnah says that the husband can nullify that vow, as long as it's not nightfall, that can't possibly be a case where it would have to be nullified for the purpose of Shabbat. It's got to be a case where it's not for the purpose of Shabbat, and yet the Mishnah says it's permitted. So therefore, our Mishnah suggests the opposite, that a husband can nullify his wife's vows even on Shabbat, even if it's not for the purpose of Shabbat. Okay, so now we have a contradiction between this baraita and the implication from our Mishnah. And so we say, indeed, Tana'ehi, there are two different Tanaitic opinions, one in the Mishnah and one in the baraita. Hafarat nedarim kol hayom Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, amiru me'ayet le'ayet. And the machloket about whether a husband can nullify vows on Shabbat, not for the purpose of Shabbat, those two opinions, whether he can or not, line up with the two opinions we saw yesterday about whether a husband has a 24-hour period from the time he heard it, from 1:30 p.m. until 1:30 p.m. the next day, or it's more limited time. And the first opinion, that was what these two pairs said, me'et le'et. Or the other opinion, which is in the Mishnah, that says until nightfall, whether it's 5 minutes or 23 and a half hours, you only have until nightfall. So this is how they match up. Watch. Leman de'amar kol hayom in tefela afilu shelo letzorech haShabbat mefer. According to our Mishnah, that says you have the whole day until nightfall, but no, not anymore. In that case, surely the husband can nullify the vow even on Shabbat, even if it's not for the purpose of Shabbat. After all, there's no other choice. If she makes a vow on Shabbat, and that's not for the purpose, she says, I'm not going to drive anymore. And so that certainly doesn't affect her activity on Shabbat, only after Shabbat. But the husband doesn't like that because, right, he needs her to drive, to go do errands. And this is going to affect their relationship. And so if he can't undo it on Shabbat, but he only has until the end of Shabbat, until nightfall, to undo it, right? Because this is the opinion that says the window of opportunity ends at nightfall. And since at the end of nightfall, since he can't do it on Shabbat, because it's not related to Shabbat, then he would never be able to nullify such vows. That would be impossible. Therefore, it's got to be that, according to our Mishnah, that says he can nullify it only until nightfall, our Mishnah would say, as Rav Ashi correctly inferred, that a husband can undo his wife's vows, even if they're not for the purpose of Shabbat. Whereas, according to the Zug, these two pairs of rabbis who say that a husband has 24 hours, no matter when it starts, well then, okay, even if she made the vow on Friday night, an hour after Shabbat started, and it has to do with driving, so it doesn't have to do with Shabbat, then the husband cannot do it on Shabbat, cannot nullify it on Shabbat, but that's okay because he'll have till an hour after Shabbat ends to nullify the vow. So as soon as Shabbat ends, he'll nullify the vow then. So because the window of opportunity extends past nightfall, so there'll always be some, even a couple of minutes, that's either before Shabbat, that will be not Shabbat, in which he can nullify the vow that does not relate to Shabbat itself. All right, good. So next question. Okay, the Mishnah in Shabbat that we just quoted says that now talking about she'elah, asking a sage to dissolve a vow, can only be done on Shabbat if it's to help Shabbat, for the purpose of Shabbat. This law that you can go to a sage to dissolve a vow Is that only when they had no chance to do so before Shabbat started? Or even if there was a chance, right, before Shabbat started? In other words, this is a leniency that we have to do this on Shabbat, because generally we don't judge, we don't sit in judgment on Shabbat. So this leniency, is it only if a guy made a vow, 5 minutes before Shabbat, that he's not going to drink wine, and then there was no chance to annul the vow, to dissolve the vow beforehand? In that case, he can go to the sage on Friday night. Listen, I said I'm not going to drink wine, but now I have to say Kiddush, Onik Shabbat, it relates to Shabbat, then you can. But maybe if he made this vow on Wednesday, so there was plenty of time to dissolve it before, in that case, you can't spend time on Shabbat doing it. That's the question. Answer: Tashema is dekiku le Rabbanan libre de Rav Zutra bere de Rav Zeira afilu bin darim shahya lehem penai mebe'od yom. Oh, we have an actual case that the sages attended to. Is dekiku, same language as zakuk, to be required. They paid attention to. They attended to. The son of Rav Zutra, the son of Rav Zeira, he who made a vow, and the rabbis dealt with his vow. Regarding that, they attended to his vow, even though there was time before Shabbat, and they could have told him, "Hey, you should have come before Shabbat." No, even though he made it way before, they still went and dealt and dissolved his vow on Shabbat. So we see from there that yes, it's permitted, even if you had a chance before Shabbat, you can still dissolve it on Shabbat, as long as it will help Shabbat. סבר רב יוסף למאמר, נשענים נדרים בשבת, ביחיד מומחה אין, בשלושה הג'ותות לה, משום דמתחזה כדינה. So Rav Yosef said, this law that you can dissolve a vow on Shabbat, it made sense to him that this should only be true by going to a single sage. Right, there's two different ways to dissolve a vow. You can go to a bet din, even though they are laymen, right? They're somewhat learned, but they're not experts. That's okay, because there's three of them or more. Or you can go to a single sage if he's an expert. So he said, on Shabbat you can go to a single expert, but to go to three people who were going to sit, well then it looks like a bet din. And there's a law, a bet din does not sit in session on Shabbat. One of the reasons is because usually a bet din, you have the court stenographer, they're writing things, they're signing documents, and so they may come to write on Shabbat. Another that's related to capital punishment, and you can't give capital punishment on Shabbat. So therefore, if you need to dissolve a vow on Shabbat, can't do it with three people, you can only do it with one expert. Rav Yosef thought to say that. אמר לאביי, כיוון דסביר עלן, אפילו מעומד, אפילו בקרובים, אפילו בלילה, לא מתחזה כדינה. Abaye said, no, not necessary, because there's so many other differences regarding dissolving vows. We say that you can do it standing. Usually if it's an official court, the judges have to be seated because they have to be concentrating, and you concentrate better when you're sitting down. But for dissolving a vow, you could do it standing up. Usually a judge cannot be a relative, but for undoing vows, it can even be relatives. This is important because a lot of times when we do Hatarat Nedarim in synagogue, there may be relatives of the three people that are sitting in judgment. And so, according to this, that would be okay. Also at night, usually a court does not sit at night. They have to see things clearly in the daytime, look at evidence. But for dissolving vows, they can do it at night because there are these important differences. So it's not going to look like a regular court session. Everybody will notice that, hey, there's relatives here. They could be doing it at night. They could be standing up. So this is not a real judicial session, and therefore they won't come to mix it up and think that you can sit in court on Shabbat, and that's why even on Shabbat you can even dissolve a vow with three people. Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav Halacha mefirin nedarim balayla. So we have a tradition, name of Rav, that this is a halacha l'maaseh. Yes, a husband can annul a vow at night. That's what Rav said. Now we ask, Shabbat. Hold on, why would Rav say that? Our Mishnah that we're commenting on says if a woman makes a vow at night, the husband can nullify it at night. So we have it's a clear Mishnah. Rav doesn't have to tell us that the halacha follows an explicit Mishnah. Ela halacha nishalin balayla. Rather, we must have heard Rav's statement incorrectly. What he actually said is that you can dissolve a vow at night, right? If someone makes a vow, they can go to a sage even at night, and the sage can dissolve it at night. That's what he said. Amar Rabbi Abba Rav Huna. Amar Rav Hachi. Now this was said in by Rabbi Abba in the name of Rav Huna and the name of Rav. So usually that means that Rav Huna actually heard Rav teach it, right? Rav said this maybe in a public lecture, and Rav Huna is repeating it. But and Rav Abba said it in his name. But Rabbi Abba wanted to clarify this from Rav Huna and he asked him, did Rav actually say that explicitly? Right? Are you sure you heard him say that? Because, right, this is a big chidush. Amar le ishtik. He said, no, actually, he didn't say explicitly, but he was silent, right? When I said it in his presence, Rav Huna said, a sage is allowed to dissolve a vow at night, and Rav was quiet. And we have a rule, shitika kehoda'a. If you're saying a halacha, if a student, especially if the student is presenting before his teacher, so then the teacher is there to correct anything that the student says. And since Rav was silent, that indicates that he agreed with the halacha. So actually he was just quiet, and that's why I said it in his name. This is really fascinating because it shows, you wonder in other cases where someone does not ask about this. When you quote something in the name of a sage, does it mean they actually said it explicitly, or maybe we inferred it from their silence? There's other cases where we say, did he say it explicitly, or mikilala, or are you inferring it from something he did, or inferring it from something else he said? So sometimes students repeat something in the name of their teacher that they didn't say explicitly. So like this would be such a case. Amar le ishti ka'amart or shate ka'amart. But then Rabbi Abba pressed him further and says, "What? Can you repeat what you said? Did you say ishtik, that I was quiet, or did you say shate, that he was drinking? Right? Maybe he was drinking something while you were presenting, and that's why he didn't react, because he was preoccupied with drinking and was not able to react. And then maybe you went on to the next topic. So Rabbi Abba is questioning Rav Huna about this tradition, even though he said this tradition. But maybe this quote is after he clarified it. So we are going to clarify it from another story. Amar Rav Ika bar Avin is the kik le Rav le Rabba bekituna debe Rav Omed Yechidi Ubalayla. In fact, we have an actual case where Rav attended to Rabbah, to his vow, and helped him dissolve his vow in a side room. That means not in the official place where a court would normally sit, but in some side room, which means he would do it even if it was not official. And so in the side room of the Bet Midrash, he did it standing, even though usually for official judgment you sit. He did it alone, even though for official judgment you need three. And he did it at night, even though usually you need it has to be during the day. And so you see here that yes, he did it at night, and therefore this tradition that Rav Huna said that sage can dissolve a vow at night is in fact authentic. And so that's probably maybe after that clarification. That's why Rabbi Abba said in the name of Rav Huna, in the name of Rav, yes, he in fact said that. Perhaps he was silent at the time, but we can prove that his silence was meaningful. He was silent because he agreed, not just because he was drinking, because Rav himself made a judgment at night, and therefore that is the halacha, that we can make judgments at night. So that's very helpful, because that explains why we would say kol nidre, kal nidre at night, and why we do sometimes say hatarat nedarim even at night. Amar Rabba Amar Rav Nachman halacha nishalim Nedarim omed yechidi ubalayla ubeshabbat ubekrobim afilu haya lehen penai mebeod yom. Here's a confirmation of the halacha that we just saw, Yes, a sage can undo a vow while standing, even alone, even at night, even on Shabbat, even if he's related. And even if they could have had time to do it before Shabbat, they still are allowed to do it on Shabbat. Okay. Omed, Vatanya. So now we have a challenge to this standing. Is that true that you can dissolve a vow while standing? We have a story in a Braita. Yarad Rabban Gamliel min hachamor v'nitatef v'yashav v'yitir lo nidra. One time Rabban Gamliel, he was riding on a donkey, and someone came and said, "Can you please help me dissolve my vow?" And Rabban Gamliel got off the donkey, and he put on a shawl. The reason for that is that judges, like today, like judges wear a robe, so too back then, a judge would wrap himself in a shawl, perhaps even his head, like we do with a talit. We put it on over our heads in concentration. That's the point, that you're not looking around, but this helps with concentration. Another reason is that when a judge is sitting and judging, so the Shekhinah is with them, because God represents justice. He is justice, and therefore a judge is actually called Elohim, and so this is a holy act, and so he's going to lihit atef in a talit because he's engaged in a holy act. This is actually quite interesting because we see here that there's two people that put on a talit, it could be official shawl or maybe just a wrap, whatever it is. But who does it? A judge and someone praying. Also, there's a story about the sages when they're studying Maaseh Merkava, right? They have to concentrate. They wrap themselves in a shawl. What do these have in common? Interestingly, the hitpalel, right? We usually translate to pray, comes from the root palel, which also means to judge, in introspecting, judging oneself. So perhaps the custom to wear a talit during prayer actually derives from judges who would wear an official robe, wrap themselves to concentrate while judging. So we want to have that similar concentration for studying deep things and for prayer as introspection. All right, so this requires some more investigation, but I think this is super interesting. Anyway, Rabban Gamliel, he would not only get off the donkey, but he would sit, and only then he dissolved this person's vow. So you see, he made sure to sit down. Why is that? Even though you just said the halacha is not so, Rav Nachman said that you could do it standing. And the answer is, this is related to another machloket. Rabban Gamliel sabar potchin becharata, mi'aka nidra ba'inan u'be'yuneh achi yashav. Rav Nachman savar en potchin becharata va'afilu me'omad. Okay, to explain this, I'm going to show you the manuscripts, because the manuscripts add a law here that ends up being the opposite of what it says in the printed version, and that ends up making more sense. So here you can see, it says Rabban Gamliel permitted, because he thought, Savar, that the printed edition says potchin becharata, but the older printed editions and one manuscript says en potchin becharata. Charata means when a person regrets. So Rabban Gamliel says you can't simply dissolve a vow because a person says, I regret making the vow. See, if you just based on that, that's an easy way. I wish I didn't make the vow. Okay, that you could do standing, right? Because it doesn't need a lot of concentration. The person says he regrets it, he wishes he never made it, so that's enough. But Rabban Gamliel, that was not sufficient grounds to undo a vow. He needed me'akad nidra ba'inan. Rabban Gamliel required uprooting the vow from the beginning based on an unforeseen circumstance, and that requires a lot of concentration. To go and ask the person who made the vow, did you realize when you made the vow that by saying that you won't be able to drink wine, that would affect your Oneg Shabbat, and it would affect this and that, and your ability to to go to a wedding, to say Havdalah, right? He says, oh, I didn't realize this, but yeah, this takes careful attention, and you have to really be sitting to figure out what the person was thinking, and whether this is a very far-fetched, unforeseen circumstance, or something that he should have known about. That's why Rabban Gamaliel sat, because he required that higher bar, and that's why he had to look at it. Whereas Rav Nachman thought that, you see in the printed edition it says N, but in other editions and all the manuscripts don't have the word N. So Rabban Nachman says, Potchin becharata. It's enough to just ask him, do you regret making the vow? I regret making the vow, and that's enough. Since it doesn't require a lot of concentration, that's why Rabban Gamaliel said that you can even do it standing up. And so that resolves the contradiction. Rav Nachman says you could do it standing up because you need the low bar of just regret. Whereas Rabban Gamaliel said, no, you have to null it to begin with, based on unforeseen circumstances that requires more concentration and sitting down. Amar le Rava le Rav Nachman, Chazi mor haime Rabbanan de'ata mima'arava, ve'amar izdikiku le Rabbanan libre de Rav Huna bar Avin ushru le nidre, ve'amru le zil u'ba'er achame al nafshach de hatat. So now a related discussion about the importance of not making vows at all, right? Because look at the story. This person, this sage who came from Eretz Yisrael, and he said, the rabbis there in Eretz Yisrael attended to a vow made by Rav Huna, the son of Avin, and they dissolved his vow. But even though they dissolved his vow, they said, also go and pray for mercy for yourself because you sinned. You sinned just by making a vow. Even though he didn't violate the vow, just making the vow is a sin. How do you know? Anyone who makes a vow, even if you fulfill the vow, still you're called a sinner. What's the source? The pasuk is V'ki techdal lindor lo yeh becha chet halo chadalta ikachet. Pasuk says, if you refrain from making a vow, then there'll be no sin. Pasuk in Nedarim, right? If you don't make a vow in the first place, then you don't even enter the possibility of maybe violating it. So therefore, don't make a vow at all. We can infer from the language here that if you do not refrain from making a vow, meaning if you do make a vow, you sin, even if it's not the Peshat. The Peshat sounds like, don't even come close, don't make a vow at all, then for sure you won't sin. But you only really officially sin if you make a vow and violate it. But we're inferring from this pasuk, and it is in the spirit of the pasuk, that if just by making a vow you're already made a sin. Not that there's going to be any official punishment for it, but still you should pray for rachamim, and don't do that again. Right? Better not to make vows at all. Okay. Tanya, ha'omer le'ishto kol nedarim shetidori, ifshi shetidori, and ze neder lo amar kelum. Okay, the last section of the daf is about language that when if a husband uses unofficial language to annul his wife's vow, that only implies but doesn't say it outright in the correct way. The correct way for a husband to annul his wife's vow is to say, as we're going to see in a second, mufarlichi. Says 3 times, it's nullified for you. Or batelichi, it's canceled for you. If he says it uses that language, that's the official language that the husband should use. But if he doesn't say that, instead he says, any vows that you make, I don't want them. I don't want you to vow. Well, that's not so clear. That's not the official language. Or if he says it is not a vow, he's not saying he's nullifying the vow. He's just saying it's not a vow, but she did make a vow. So it's as if he said nothing. It's not sufficient, because she made a vow, and now you have to cancel it. So you have to say language that says explicitly that he's canceling it. However, if he wants to ratify the vow, then it's enough if he says it even in a different language. He says, Yafe asit, en kemotech, ve'im lo nadat medirech ani devarav kayamin. If she made a vow and he said, oh, that's nice that you did that, or he says, there's nobody like you, in praise, right? You're the best. Or if he says, even if you didn't make a vow like that, I would have asked you to make a vow like that. In that case, it's okay. Why? See, ratification needs a lower bar, because even if the guy does nothing, by the end of the day, it will kick in. So therefore, even if he ratifies just in his head, right, that already has some effect. So if he says it at all, he's not changing the status quo. She made a vow. The vow was there, so it will continue to be there, and it will be ratified even if he says language that's not the usual language. Whereas for annulling a vow, there he's changing the status quo. The vow is there, the prohibition exists. He has to take it away. In that case, he has to use the official language. Now, lo amar adam leishto b'shabbat mufar lo yomar adam leishto b'shabbat mufar lichi batel lichi kederach shomer la bechol. Now, even though during a weekday he is supposed to say the official language, but on Shabbat he should use a different language. Even though we said your husband is allowed to annul his wife's vow on Shabbat, still he should change the way he does it. Don't say like the usual phrase, "It's annulled for you," it's canceled for you, like he says on a weekday. Ela omer la teli v'ichli, teli ushti, v'aneder batel me'elav. Rather, if she makes a vow on Shabbat, or he hears about it on Shabbat, as she's not going to eat meat, so then on Shabbat he could take the meat and say, "Here, eat the meat." Right? He'll have in mind, "Oh, I don't want this vow. I want it to be canceled." Right? He could think about it, but he doesn't have to say it. Just by offering her meat, or if she says, "I'm not going to drink wine," and he says, "Here, drink the wine," that that thought of canceling and the action of commanding her to take it and drink, that makes her vow canceled, and that's more proper to do on Shabbat. Amar Rabbi Yochanan v'sarich sheyibatel belibo. Rabbi Yochanan adds, not just say it, but also have in mind that he is canceling the vow. That's the two things together. Tanya, Bet Shammai omerim b'Shabbat mebatel belibo, b'chol mosi b'sfatav, uBet Hillel omerim echad ze v'echad ze mebatel belibo v'en sarich losi b'sfatav. We're learning in a braita that what we just talked about is subject to a machloket. Bet Shammai says on Shabbat, to have it in mind that he's going to cancel. He wants the vow to be canceled, but on a weekday he should say it outright. So he agrees that there is a difference between them, and so this lines up with what we said here. Whereas Bet Hillel says, no, on Shabbat and even during a weekday, it's sufficient to nullify it in his heart, and he doesn't have to say the official language outright. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen.